We have more for Your Ears Only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Axelbarth with a quote from the news. Dump Trump. That was the demand of a signon.org online petition drawing 50,000 signatures a day, meant to stop the Macy's chain from selling Donald Trump's signature collection because of his controversial political and social views. A similar petition whacked Target for making employees work on Thanksgiving to prepare for Black Friday sales, which could cause a walkout. And an ongoing strike by union bakers led Hostess Brands to end operations, though it may find a buyer to keep making Twinkies, Devil Dogs, and Wonder Bread. Now this.
The debt may not have a face, but the solution does. Yours. The campaign to fix the debt is your opportunity to be part of the solution and have your voice heard. Those preventing action need to change their mind, and those doing it right need to know we have their backs.
From a video produced by Fix the Debt, a grassroots and business-backed project of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget that urges compromise and increased revenue and decreased spending to avoid the fiscal cliff of draconian automatic steps in that direction, and more reasonably reduce a federal deficit that has topped $1 trillion for the last 4 years. But are the right people listening?
There was surprising cordiality at last week's meeting between President Obama and congressional leaders, even a birthday gift for House Speaker John Boehner. But confusion continued over the key issue of raising taxes on incomes over $250,000 annually, if only as a symbol of fairness that permits reform and restraint in ever-expanding entitlement programs and other spending. And some prominent financial figures, including former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan and business guru Warren Buffett last week, suggested that going off the cliff might not be so bad. For one view of the challenge, we're joined again by Marc Goldwein, Policy Director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
First, let's get a progress report on your Fix the Debt campaign. How many petition signers now?
We're well over 300,000 petition signers. We've raised something. We've raised more than $30 million. We have business leaders, civic leaders, CEOs, and ordinary citizens from around the country supporting us with one message. Politicians need to come together to fix the debt.
You mentioned major CEOs from major corporations. What are some of the more familiar ones?
Well, Dave Cote of Honeywell is very active. Mark Bertolini from Aetna. We have a number of CEOs that are very interested in this issue and really think we need to solve this problem.
You also picked up a significant small business group.
We have small businesses from around the country that all agree that the worst thing that can happen is if they lose their customer base because we either go off the fiscal cliff or fail to deal with our rising debt.
But some liberal groups say your coalition has at least a few self-serving goals on its agenda, including a so-called territorial tax system that would avoid as much as $134 billion in taxes on foreign revenue. That's, I guess, mostly for big business. Talk about that and whether your participating CEOs would give it up as a gesture of common sacrifice.
Many of those that support the Fix the Debt campaign and the Simpson-Bowles Commission did recommend a territorial system, but that's not one of the key principles of the Fix the Debt campaign. We don't really get into specifics. We believe that you do need to have tax reform that both reduces rates and raises more revenue, which means you have to go after a lot of the tax preferences. On how exactly we format the international code, we want to see where policymakers are willing to go and where the deal is and where the compromise is.
How did you read the rhetoric at last week's meetings the president held with business leaders and congressional leaders?
I think everything is looking pretty positive. I'm not ready to declare victory, but there does seem to be a willingness from both sides to work together. Republicans have voiced an openness to revenue. The president has said that he's serious about reforming our entitlement programs. So I'm optimistic we can find a solution.
What about the argument that going over the fiscal cliff, at least briefly, could actually aid a long-term solution? With all taxes raised back to pre-Bush era levels, Congress would only have to consider new cuts, which are always popular and they haven't sworn to avoid.
I don't think that those that advocate no new taxes are going to be tricked by, policy changing over the course of the week. Would it be easier to negotiate a deal after the election? After the new year, maybe. But as my old boss, Erskine Bowles, says, you'd be betting your country. You'd be betting your country that you can come to a resolution in very early January. Otherwise, we could go into a very quick and deep recession. And that's not a risk politicians should be willing to make.
Your Fix the Debt project is mounting a broad public education campaign, but does it focus sufficiently on the much smaller arena of Republican primaries, where GOP congressmen who compromise may be challenged by outraged conservatives who are the party's dominant base in many areas?
Well, I think it's an unfortunate fact in American politics that primaries pull people to the extremes and result in sort of a less moderate set of members of Congress. The Fix the Debt campaign can't be all things. We can't do political reform in addition to Social Security reform, tax reform, health reform, and spending cuts. But we are focused on trying to let the politicians know that the public, left, right, and center, is behind them if they're willing to make the hard choices.
Do you think your CEOs and other supporters, maybe independently, could form a political action committee to actually support Republicans who support compromise and face challenge?
I wouldn't rule anything out. We're just concerned about sort of getting the public and civic leaders and business leaders together with a single message that we need to solve this problem.
But doesn't the problem seem to be not the public? The polls seem to show the public is already on your side. It gets down to that small bottleneck of Republican congressmen and the challenges they face for being reasonable.
Well, the problem isn't that the public isn't there, but the problem is I think a lot of the politicians don't realize it. Yes, there's problems with the primaries, but when people get to Washington, they think the public isn't willing to accept tax increases or isn't willing to accept cuts in their entitlement programs. But it turns out they are, so long as it's part of a big comprehensive deal that actually solves the problem. And that's what we want to let the policymakers know the public is there with them.
What did you make of the comments by Greenspan and Buffett that going over the fiscal cliff into some recession, at least briefly, might not be so bad, and maybe force Congress into a compromise they can't reach without a crisis?
I would hope that the expectation of a crisis that's only 6 weeks away would be enough of motivation for Congress to act. As I said before, if we go over the cliff in order to negotiate, we're betting the country. We're betting that we can come to a deal in very early January, because if we don't, we're going into a deep dive recession. And even before that, the markets may start to react pretty negatively.
Marc Goldwein is policy director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget.
Quote from the news: "Even a few pernicious people in the wrong place are a potential source of vulnerability." That was a conclusion in the National Academy of Sciences report on America's power grid as a target of terrorist attack. Completed in 2007, the report was classified and withheld from the public until last week to avoid creating a, quote, cookbook for undermining the nation's stability.
Next, Mother, Son, and Song for your ears only.